remember, the goal of this method is to have direct carryover to how we're going to perform the main lift. So this will feel almost like a really heavy stiff leg style deadlift, but that's kind of because it is. What's up, guys? So we just finished recording a cool podcast episode with Naomi. It's basically a case study about some of her competition preps that she's used throughout her career, basically highlighting some of the more unconventional methods that we've used. And the progressive range of motion method was involved in that. And now this is one that, since her Pro-Am world record world squat that she kind of tracked on Instagram, where we could see her progressing through it, this is one that we continue to get quite a lot of questions about. So here we go. We're going to go through it and kind of explain to you what it is, what's the benefits of it, and then how you can program it for yourself as well. So the progressive range of motion method, also known as the neurological carryover method, was invented by Paul Anderson. And very simply, it involves taking the load that you want to be able to hit at the end of your training cycle and hitting that or performing work with that for progressively larger ranges of motion as your training cycle goes on. Now, the frequency with which you lift that load can be quite different. It can be once a week, it can be twice a week, it could be once a month if you're an equipped lifter. But the idea is very simple, that you are going to overload the stimulus, not by changing the load, but by changing the range of motion that you go through. So that's going to be like for box, usually a box squat for the squat, or it could be done to pins. It'll be a board press or a pin press on your bench press, and then it will be from blocks or pins on a deadlift. So what we're going to do is take a small increment over our current 1 rep max. For most people, anywhere between 1 and 3% is a really good load to go with, because quite simply, if you get too greedy, it tends to backfire and be too much of a stimulus and you don't make progress. Now, as we'll go through on the programming side, if you're a little bit too conservative with the load, the worst thing that happens is when you do your test at the end of the cycle, you just end up hitting it for multiple reps. For example, in Naomi's example, and maybe we can cut in some videos from her Instagram where we can see her training cycle leading up to that all-time world record. She actually hit her desired weight, which was 510 pounds, for a double at the end of her training cycle. So yes, we could have put 5 or 10 pounds more on it and hit 1, but that was still enough of an improvement, and it told us exactly where we needed to be going into that competition. So it's a very cool and unusual method. Paul Anderson actually originally used it by digging a hole in his garden and then deadlifting whilst he was in the hole, which basically made what we would use as a block pull now. And then every week he would shovel in some dirt and get progressively higher up until he was lifting that bar from a traditional deadlift start position. And from his, I believe in his barn, he would hang the squat bar off chains and then just lower those chains a little bit over time until he was basically starting in the bottom position, and then he knew he was ready to test. So we're going to delve into how we are going to program this, but also the benefits that we're going to get out of it as well next. Okay, so what scenarios is the progressive range of motion method going to be suitable in? And what are the benefits that we're going to gain from it? So first off, this is a method that is probably best used with more advanced lifters. The reason for that is that it's going to require a certain level of technique, so that when we are doing the box squats, the board presses, and so on, that we are able to maintain the same positions and bar path, etc., that we would see in the full lift when we're doing those partial ranges of motion. We'll do a couple of short videos on the common faults that we see there. So we want to make sure that regardless of the range of motion that we're using, we can still mimic the exact position that we would be in the main lift or the full lift if we were to perform it in that manner. So that's first off why it's important. Second off, it's going to be pretty neurologically demanding. Now, you need to have a pretty good background of handling maximal or even supermaximal loads, so that even the psychological stress of this training method doesn't end up draining you too much. So that means that when we're getting under that bar, we don't want to be revving ourselves up, because we're going to be doing multiple sets to whatever box height or board height we're going to be doing. If we're really nervous and having to amp ourselves up greatly for each of those sets, then we're going to burn out before we get to the end of the workout, and ultimately we're not going to recover from the program overall. But if you're someone who has very well developed technique, probably has enough muscle mass to, should we say, support the level of strength that they want, because this isn't going to be a great method for hypertrophy, and has a good psychological profile for lifting heavy, then this is going to be a great method for you, one that you're probably going to very much enjoy. So now, what benefits are we going to get when we implement this method? Now, a big one is going to be the desensitization of the Golgi tendon organs. So basically they exist in the crossover between the muscle and the tendon, and they're basically like little handbrakes for your body, because your body doesn't want you to be able to create or produce 100% of the force that you're capable of, because for most people that would actually pull the muscle straight off the bone. Now, we can desensitize those, and heavy training does that. Adrenaline also does that, which is why, for example, you see like stories about like, mom picks up back of car to save her baby or whatever. You put enough adrenaline into a system, those Golgi tendon organs will desensitize and allow you to use a greater proportion of the force that you're already capable of producing. When most of us step foot in the gym, we're probably only capable of actually showing about 30, maybe 40% of the force we're capable of. Then once you get up to more advanced athletes, we're talking like 80 to 90%. So it allows us to desensitize those Golgi tendon organs basically by putting a heavy load on you, having you produce a lot of force, and then basically illustrating to the body that, look, when you move this load or produce this amount of force, nothing bad happens. Then over time, they will desensitize. Next up, we've got the ability to recruit the high threshold motor units, which most of the time is the fast twitch fibers, and we're increasing your firing rate. So basically what happens is, once we get to about 80% of your 1 rep max, we will have recruited all of the muscle fibers that we can. So how do we get stronger at that point? How do we lift even more? Well, the firing rate goes up, which is basically the rate at which those muscles twitch and they act in myosin cross bridges, uncouple and recouple, so on and so forth. That is where like peaking and like things like overcoming isometrics and stuff like that really play a role, and because they develop that. So as an advanced athlete, we can make it easier for you to recruit those high threshold motor units, because at this point, you're not going to have a lot of neurological adaptations left, and we're going to need some pretty extreme stimuli to go ahead and get them. So that's where this is going to come in there. We're going to improve your ability to recruit all your high threshold motor units and fire them more quickly instantaneously is the goal. So that we're not going to require, should we say, more reps on your volume work to get up to a high level of activation. And then as soon as we get under the bar for a PR attempt, we know exactly how to fire everything at once, which obviously is very important if you're a competitive powerlifter. Next off is going to be your tendon development. Now again, especially as an advanced lifter, they are quite often going to be your limiting factor, because you probably have enough muscle mass to produce the force you want, but structurally we need to be able to funnel that force into the bar or whatever the object is. And the thicker and stronger your tendons are, the more efficiently they can funnel the force that your muscle is creating into the bone, which is ultimately then what moves whatever the object is that we're moving. Obviously, there's going to be a resiliency and like an injury prevention aspect of that as well. Heavy or really supermaximal weights are the absolute best way to stimulate tendon development. Obviously, the problem is we can't do a lot of volume at those loads because they're incredibly taxing. But using this type of method, where a lot of our work is done over shorter ranges of motion, allows us to accumulate a lot of volume with those very high loads that are good for our tendons, which means we can genuinely stimulate them to make some progress. We also have the postural strength. Now, I would say the tendon strength and the postural strength, say you're an equipped lifter out there, these are the two biggest benefits you're going to get, because you need your tendons to be strong enough to put up with the supermaximal loads that you're controlling, and you need to actually be able to hold the thing, which is probably half the battle for a lot of you. So this type of method, I'm not saying you need to do it as we talk about today, but can have huge benefits for those of you that use equipment or assisted lifting. So we are going to increase postural strength, whether that's bracing, upper back strength, whatever it might be compared to the lift that you're performing, but we're going to be spending a lot of time supporting a supermaximal load. So whether it's your upper back, your abs, your obliques, whatever it might be, you are going to have time and a lot of stimulus there building up those structures and the ability of them to hold the desired alignment that we want when we're under those supermaximal loads. So that can be a great benefit there. Now, one not to be understated is confidence. Getting under supermaximal loads or getting under a weight for the first time is pretty intimidating. No matter how experienced you are, there's always going to be an effect there of nervousness or whatever. So with this method, if you're someone who tends to choke should we say, like gets to the test or the competition or whatever, puts that load on their back or whatever that they've not felt before, and instantly has that nervous or that anxious response to it. You can usually see it even in their posture or their eyes. This can be a great method for you because you get under that load every week or every other week or even twice a week, depending on how you set it up. So by the time you come to actually lift that load through the full range of motion, you've been here before. Like, for example, when we just did that podcast with Naomi, this was one of the reasons we used this method, because she had come back from a pretty bad back injury. It took her about 3 years to get back to the level where she was at. She wasn't used to putting 500 pounds on her back anymore. So that was one of the reasons that this method featured in her prep, is because that 510 pounds, whatever the world record was that she was going for, it allowed her to put that weight on her back every other week, was how we set it up. And by the time she got to that competition, there was no fear of her hurting her back, no like bad feelings about it, no anxiousness. It's like, no, I've been there, I know my body can handle this. And then you can focus purely on lifting the thing rather than worrying about your body falling apart when you do. And then last but certainly not least, it's fun. If you're a competitive strength athlete or you're watching this YouTube channel, chances are you like to lift heavy. And the PRM method essentially allows you to lift a maximal or supermaximal load every single week for multiple sets. That's pretty fun. And it allows you to do that in a consistent manner that's actually productive to your long-term progress without burning out. So there's a huge amount of positives here. Now, I'm not saying it's suited for absolutely everyone, but it's definitely a methodology that could feature for some people at some point in their training cycle to get a load of unique and interesting benefits of it. So next up, we're just going to look about how you go about programming this into a training cycle. We've talked about the myriad of benefits that you can get from using this method. So hopefully your next question is, cool, how do I do it? So that's what we're going to cover now. Now, first, most important thing to remember is the reason this method backfires is because people get greedy and they put in the percentage that they really want to hit at the end of the cycle rather than what's probably realistic. So as a general guide, you want to do anywhere between 100 and 103% of your 1 rep max for your training load for this range of motion cycle. If you go above that, most people are not going to have success. And the reason for that is because we talked about the Golgi tendon organs already. Too much of an overload and too much stress can actually inhibit them rather than cause them to, should we say, relax or allow them to give you more force. So we end up overloading these lifts too much. It's the same with partials and eccentric overloads and everything else. It can actually have opposite effect of what we want, which is relaxing that response and allowing us to have more access to the force we can already produce. So first off, there's only so much progress you can make in a 10, 12-week training cycle anyway. And B, we need to make sure we get enough volume with the reps that we're doing, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then C, from a neurological point of view, more is not better in terms of stimulus. So even 100%, right? Let's say your 1 rep max is 500 pounds right now. Well, even if you go with that as your training weight, if you do everything right, by the end of your training cycle, then maybe you'll hit 500 for 2 or for 3. That's still a big return and improvement on where you were at the beginning of the cycle. It doesn't have to be necessarily more load. But if you are going to go super maximal and above your current 1RM, just a couple of percent is enough. For example, Naomi's cycle that she did with this, we put in her training max, I believe, at 510, which, was like 2.5, 3% above her max. And then she hit it for a double at the end. So nothing better could have happened, even if we did go higher in that load, because she still managed to hit above her old 1 rep max for a double at the end of, I believe it was 14 weeks. So don't get greedy with the load. Now, every time you perform this workout, the progressive range of motion work on that lift is the main lift. And it's done for 2 to 3 sets of as many reps as possible. And now when we say as many reps as possible whilst maintaining the technique and the positions that we would want to see in a max effort full range of motion lift. We start hitching, we start rounding, we start doing anything ugly that we wouldn't want to see in a max effort lift. It needs to stop ideally before that. So it's an AMRAP within reason, okay? The idea that we should be accumulating a reasonable amount of volume with that load on our back or whatever, especially in the first half of the training cycle. As a general rule of thumb, in the first 1 or 2 weeks, if you're not getting 15 to 20 reps, you've either started too heavy or you don't have the prerequisite motor control, postural strength, etc. to get on with this training cycle or training style. The exception to that would be if you're equipped, because the rep ranges kind of differ for equipped, right? If you're a raw lifter, as you go through this progressive range of motion cycle, the range of motion increases. As you can imagine, the reps drop off. But if you're an equipped lifter, as that range of motion increases, yes, it gets harder, but your equipment also does more to support you. So the reps drop off much more slowly if you're an equipped lifter. So you might start lower because you're lifting a small range of motion but getting very little to no help from your equipment, but then they'll taper off slower and you still end up in the same place. Whereas with that raw lifter, you're gonna start up higher, like 15 to 20, and then it's gonna taper down considerably more, maybe to 1 or 2, or if you're lucky, 3 at the end of that cycle. So 2 to 3 sets of an AMRAP. I would say favor 3 in the first kind of half to 2/3 of your training cycle. As that range of motion increases and you get quite close to that full range of motion and it becomes more stressful, I would drop towards 2. Now, in terms of frequency, you could do this on all your main lifts once per week. If you're, say, an advanced intermediate and your training loads aren't super high, or you have a very good recoverability, especially in terms of a neurological aspect. But you don't have to. It could be done every other week. For example, you could do progressive range of motion on half of your main lifts one week, and then for the other half, the next week. And then those other main lifts could be trained for like dynamic effort or speed work or technique work, whatever it might be in that week there, and you alternate back and forth between. That can work really well because you still keep some practice for the full range of motion, whilst over here you're doing that progressive range of motion method, which obviously for a lot of that training cycle is not helping you practice or strengthen that bottom end of the range of motion. If you don't go down that route, you're gonna need to keep some assistance work in your program for the vast majority of the training cycle that focuses on that bottom end, because we're obviously going to be getting stronger from the top down, but we're going to kind of be neglecting that bottom half of the range, at least for most of the cycle. So for example, you might do your back squat to a box for your 3 sets of AMRAP. After that, you would choose an exercise that helps you strengthen that bottom position. Ideally, I would choose something that also includes a slightly larger range of motion than you would use in your regular back squat. So that could be like a narrow stance, heels elevated, paused back squat. It could be a front squat. It could be a Frankenstein squat. It doesn't really matter too much. Something that's going to stress that bottom position quite largely so that we're not weak in that position when this cycle then eventually comes around to those lower ranges of motion. So we're looking at training frequency. If you're a raw lifter, you could do it every week for all your lifts. That's going to be very good recovery, lower training loads. Most of you, if you're a little bit more advanced, probably going to be better off doing them every other week, ideally in like an alternating fashion. So you might do squat and bench one week, deadlift the next, or flip that if you find deadlift the more stressful one. You might do, squat more stressful. You might do squat on its own, and then bench and deadlift would be the week after, go back and forth like that. If you're an equipped lifter, the frequency is going to depend more on the amount of kit that you use, because obviously that's going to change how high the training load is. Now, I remember when we had Dave Hoff out here one of those times, he was talking about how he does his overloaded squats out of the monolift, and he just basically racks the monolift at the height that he wants, and he does that every month, and he doesn't go to a full range of motion. I'm not saying he's doing this method, but what he is doing once a month throughout his training cycle, he's taking the weight that he wants to hit at the end of his training cycle from a pin, maybe just for one set for a couple of reps, I don't know, and then the next time he does it, he's doing it 1 or 2 notches lower on the monolift and going through. So it could be as low as once per month, or it could be every other week. It's going to depend on how much equipment you have on and how high those training loads are. If you're an 1,000-pound squatter, then once a month is probably enough to recover from as it is and to get all the benefits that we want there. Now, how to set up your cycle in terms of how many workouts and what time frame to do it over. In reality, the more workouts you can split this progression into, the better it's going to work, the smoother the transition is going to be. So the absolute minimum I would suggest would be to do 6 workouts. Now 6 would include the last one, which is the test, which is the full range of motion lift, which hopefully we'll do for more than 1 rep. So that could be like a 5 board, 4 board, 3 board, 2 board, 1 board, and then the last workout would be full range. That would be 6 workouts. That would be the fastest way that I would cycle through it. In a perfect world, you'd add half boards and you do that. The other way to run it would be to just stick to a height until you feel that that height has improved in performance and is more comfortable. So then you obviously wouldn't have a deadline on the end of that program. So that doesn't work quite so well if you're prepping, but that is another way that you can run it. But for most of you, somewhere between 8 and 10 sessions is probably going to be the way that it's going to feel the most enjoyable. It's going to have the smoothest rate of progress throughout, and it's going to lead to the best end result. But less than that can work, 5 or even 6 sessions can work, provided we're not too greedy up here. Because if those 6 sessions are being done over 12 weeks, if you're doing it every other week, for example, there's only so much you can progress in that time. And now, the last point is probably the most crucial for actually making the program work when you're performing it, and that is that the technique that you use on these partial ranges of motion is very important. And what I mean by that is how we're performing that box squat or that pin pull or that board press needs to imitate the full range lift. If we are strengthening positions that we will never be in on the full range of motion lift, we are not going to get the carryover that we want to see in the full range. So make sure that you're filming your sets and performing them in the same manner. Now, Naomi and I are now going to go through probably the most common faults we see when people are using this method and why they don't see carryover to the main lift. So let's take a quick look at performing the progressive range of motion method for the squat. Now, the most common fault that we see here is people rocking back onto the box in the squat. Now, there's an argument to be made and a time and a place to do your box squats like that. But remember, the goal of this method is to have direct carryover to how we're going to perform the main lift. So we want to mimic the positions that we're going to see when we do that main lift. So if we have a look at Naomi now, she's going to do this box squat rocking back. And as you can see, when she does that and she rocks back, if you look at where the bar is in relation to her foot, it's way behind her midfoot, which is a position she would never ever be in a free squat, raw or equipped, right? So what we want to see now is imagine the box isn't there. Just squat straight down and then almost use it as just like a depth gauge. Don't think about it, just squat straight down. Just hold on that bottom position for me. What we want is this bar to be over her midfoot, because that's where it's supposed to be when we perform that full range of motion lift there. So that can be a good check on whether the reps that you're performing are being done in the manner that you want. Set up a camera or your phone, whatever, from the side, film that bar path, and you want it staying above that midfoot the whole time. If you're getting down to that box and then you watch the bar path drift back behind your midfoot, then you just need to cue yourself out of that and basically imagine that like you can only put half the weight on the box. So imagine it's fragile and you can't sit onto it and have it completely support you. Sit down, stay reasonably tense, put about half the weight on it, don't let anything move extraneously, and then push back up. Now, for those of you who don't have plyo boxes or adjustable boxes like that, you can just use bumper plates or plates and stack them up, and that can be super easy because you can just take one off every session. So there's usually a way that just about everyone can set this up. Worst case, you can go in a power rack and do it from pins. If you're going to do that, just make sure that you lower it onto the pin reasonably carefully, because that rapid unloading and reloading can sometimes mess up your technique and throw you around. Next up, the bench press. So the most common fault that we see here when people are doing their board presses for this specific reason with the progressive range of motion method is allowing it to sink in too far, which then causes their upper arm and their elbow to flare out. So again, they just end up in a position that they would never want to be in for that full range press, where their elbows are heavily winged out. They're basically relaxing their upper back and not supporting the load, and then having to scoop back under the load. So if we just watch Naomi now, we'll see what I mean by this. Naomi's going to do a couple of reps where she allows that to happen, right? So she's going to basically allow the weight of the bar to sink in, and she's going to have the arms wing out, hold there. As you can see, the elbow is behind the wrist, and now when she actually wants to press up, the elbows have to scoop under. Now when she does that, her shoulders also end up elevating. She loses all of that upper back tightness. So let's go and do a good one now. Again, 50% of the weight touches down. She drives it. See how the elbow now stays stacked under the board, under the wrist, and we keep the alignment that we would want to see in that full range of motion. So there, she's not using the board as an excuse to be lazy in the bottom position. She's using the board almost as like, again, a depth gauge, and not entirely unloading, so that we can keep everything in the upper back and everything else tight while she's executing the rep. Because remember, you're not just going to be doing one rep here. You might be doing as high as 15 to 20 in the early weeks. And if you're allowing that upper back posture to degrade by winging out like that, then you're not going to get very far before your structure is so far gone that you can't get any more reps. Right, last but not least in our section on how to not mess up your partial range of motion lifts is the deadlift. Now, the most common fault here by a mile is hitching, which is just wedging the knees underneath the bar. Now, obviously, if you're a strongman, this is allowed in your comp, but I would still probably argue it's best not to train that way all the time. The problem with this, again, is that we're never going to be in that position when we lock out a powerlifting style deadlift. We're never going to lift it up, rebend the knee, support the weight on the legs, and even if you did, you'd get failed for it anyway. So what we want to see is us starting in that same position we would in a full range where the shins have already moved back. So if we watch Naomi do some hitching reps now, what we can see is at the start of the lift, her knees are in front of the bar and the bar is on her quads. And if she wanted to, she could partially support that weight on her quads. We're basically turning this into like a mini squat, okay? Now, and if we wanted to mimic where we're at in a full range deadlift, the knees will have extended, the shins will pretty much be vertical. All of this top half of the deadlift is posterior chain dominant. It's almost a pure hip hinge. So this will feel almost like a really heavy stiff leg style deadlift, but that's kind of because it is. So it should feel like almost entirely on the hamstrings and glutes here, because that's what's doing the work when we're in that top range on the full deadlift. Now, if you do hitch your reps, what you'll find is, A, you don't end up strengthening the hamstrings and glutes in the way that you want. And then when you get to that midpoint now where the bar passes below the knee, your reps will just tumble off because you've been cheating essentially for the rest of the range of motion. And you haven't built the posterior chain strength that you need to get the full range benefit.